Welcome back, warriors. I hope you had a good, peaceful weekend. I hope everyone in your household is well, and I hope that you found a way to kind of get out and stretch your legs at some point this weekend while doing it in a ethical and moral way and maintaining social distance. If you're having any difficulty right now at home in terms of resources, both technology or food or anything like that, please don't hesitate to reach out to us here at school and we'll see if we can hook you up with the correct social resources. So today, what we're going to be doing, guys, is we're going to be talking about, we're going to finish up talking about the Italian Renaissance in terms of artistic production, and we're going to move north into the Holy Roman Empire and a lot of the Germanic states, also France, the UK as well. And we're going to talk a little bit about the Northern Renaissance. So today, I am really excited to be able to talk about art with you guys. Tomorrow, you're going to do nothing but art for me in class. That's going to be part of our assignment. So today what I want to do is kind of lay the groundwork about why the Renaissance is so different and important in terms of artistic production. So that being said, let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing I want to do is the last thing we talked about on Friday was we talked about some of the major intellectual changes that came about during the Renaissance. We talked a little bit about secularism, about humanism, about how there was an emphasis on sort of valuing the achievements of this world. We talked about the rise of individualism in terms of artistic production. Now, during the Renaissance in Italy, from about the 14th century, that is the 1300s, to the 16th centuries, that's the 1500s, what we start to see in Western Europe is that there are significant changes in terms of artistic styles and production, as well as in terms of architecture. What we tend to see is, firstly, we see a rise in secular subjects, meaning that we see the adoption of more subjects that are not religious in nature. Now, I don't want you to think that all of a sudden artists stopped producing religious works. That is not true at all. Most of the art produced during the Renaissance, like most art produced prior to the Renaissance in Western Europe, had religious elements to it. But what you do start to see are an increase of individual portraits. Wealthy people would hire portrait painters to come in and have their families' likenesses taken. You have to remember that, of course, this is a time during which there are no photographs. And so after someone passes, the only way you have to remember what they looked like would be an artist rendering. So what we see are an increase in portraiture, particularly of women and children, which is new to us. But we also see the adoption of a lot of pre-Christian themes and ideas in art during this period, especially allegories towards Greek or Roman myths. We'll see a lot of those. We see a really frank and accurate depiction of the human form. And it's incredibly accurate stuff. So you'll see a lot of nude paintings in the Renaissance. And just so you understand, I am not going to censor nudity in great works of art. That's very silly. And I am going to assume that you guys can handle this. It's not meant to titillate. It is meant to educate. So you see really frank depictions of the human form. And what that tells us is that artists of this era, we absolutely 100% know that they attended and sometimes even performed human dissections. They performed autopsies. We know that both Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci participated in these activities, which is deeply, deeply interesting because those activities were forbidden by the Catholic Church. It was considered to be a desecration of the body to have an autopsy performed upon it after a person's death. And so the fact that you have these artists who are working very closely with the church, sometimes even with the church as their patron, that they are directly going against church teachings and doing things that could get them excommunicated or even jailed is really interesting. We also see the adoption of something called linear perspective and composition. I'm actually going to have you guys do a little bit of an activity. If you like, I'm going to give you a choice tomorrow. And one of the activities is to try your hand at linear perspective. And linear perspective gives the illusion of three dimensions. It requires quite a lot of math, and it requires quite a lot of attention to detail. So art here is not just about like what you feel and colors and like, that sort of stuff. It's also about precision and science and an understanding of mathematics that I think a lot of people don't really understand about art. We also see an adoption of brand new techniques and materials. In particular, we see the widespread use in the Italian Renaissance of something called a fresco. A fresco is when you paint directly onto the wall, but not as a mural. Instead, what you do is you take plaster and you spread it upon the wall, and while the plaster is still wet, you paint directly on top of the plaster. Now, what this does is it locks the pigment in place. It prevents it from flaking off. If you just take paint and paint on a wall, eventually, like, it will wear off. This is something that occurs. If you've ever seen someone like paint a mural on the side of a building, like if it's not maintained, it will flake off over time. But a fresco, if done properly, the paint it becomes embedded in the plaster on the wall itself. Now, the problem with this is that as soon as the plaster is dry, you can't change it. You can't just like paint on top of it to fix it. If you do that, that top paint level layer won't bond properly and it will flake off very, very quickly. So fresco is really difficult to work with, and several of the works that we're going to talk about today are done entirely in fresco, which is incredibly impressive because once the plaster is laid down, you have about 2 to 3 hours max to be able to paint it, and that's it. You also have the adoption of oil paints, although not so much in the Italian Renaissance, and the use of a technique called chiaroscuro. Chiaroscuro, it's an Italian word. In Spanish, it would translate as claro oscuro. It essentially means light versus dark. It is using extreme like highlights of light and darkness to give paintings additional drama and vitality to them. I'll show you an example of that as we go. And what we also see is during this time, artists who have mastered these techniques, whose work is so highly valued by various famous families like the Medici, they become almost like rock stars. This is where you wind up with the Ninja Turtles. This is where you have Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Raphael, all of whom were living and working and producing great works in Florence, in Italy at the same time. In fact, they sort of knew each other. Now, Donatello, just for you like Ninja Turtle fans out there, was a much earlier artist. He was influential to people like Michelangelo, but he was around way earlier than the others. So, the first piece I really want to talk about, you've got in your notes down there, there's a little bit of a box, and I do want to kind of like talk you through this. Excuse me. So, what you have here is the statue of David. So this is Michelangelo's David. Lots of artists have produced statues of David. And the David in question here is David from the biblical story David and Goliath. In the story, David is a shepherd and he brings down a monstrous enemy with nothing but his slingshot. And you can see David's slingshot is resting here on his shoulders. So the statue that Michelangelo has created here is about 18 feet tall. It's extraordinarily large. It is anatomically detailed in a really perfect sort of way. I love looking at the hands. I mean, check this out. Check out the detail. This is all one single piece of marble. And essentially, the technique that Michelangelo used here is called subtractive sculpture. So what he had initially was an enormous block of marble. Here, I'm going to kind of draw a little bit so that you guys can kind of see. Up, up, up. There's my pen. All right. So he had this enormous block of marble initially. Yeah? Wah. And then what he did was he knew he wanted to make this statue. So what he did was he created a tiny model of the image of David that he wanted to create, and he made it out of wax. And then he submerged it in a bucket of water. And then every day he would remove a little bit of water from the top of the bucket. And as he did so, the tiny little sculpture of David that he had modeled out of clay, or rather wax, would emerge. So on the first day, what he would do is just try to carve out, excuse me, let me change out the color. He would just try to carve out this little tiny bit, just this, emerging from the block of stone. And then the next day, he would take off another layer of stone and he'd carve down further and he'd do it small by like tiny layer by tiny layer by tiny layer. Now, Michelangelo was unquestionably a genius. This sort of sculpting is incredibly difficult. If you make one mistake, if you hit the stone in such a way that the statue is unable to support its own weight, it will break. So he had a really wonderful understanding of sort of the engineering principles behind creating a sculpture that could stand on its own. He's using a technique here called contrapposto, which if you look here, David's weight is basically placed right here through this portion of the statue. It makes him look more alive. He could make him stand with both feet flat on the floor, but that makes statues not look very lifelike. Here, David looks like he's moving. This is a very, very interesting statue for a number of reasons. I'm actually going to include a little video about David and why he's so cool in your notes for the rest of the class. It's not required that you watch the video, but if you're interested in art at all, I do highly recommend that you watch it. So, Michelangelo was not just a sculptor, although he definitely thought of himself as such. This is perhaps the work that Michelangelo is best known for, and this is the interior of the Sistine Chapel. The Sistine Chapel is located within the Vatican in Rome, and it is the heartbeat of the Catholic Church. When a pope passes away and a new pope is selected, this is the place where all the cardinals gather and vote to elect a new pope. This is the heart of the Catholic Church. And all of Michelangelo's work include the ceiling, of which you can see part of it right here. Bop, bop, bop. That's the ceiling. And also this beautiful blue altarpiece right here. Oh, excuse the terrible drawing. This altarpiece right here is called The Last Judgment, and in it you have a figure of Christ with Mary seated beside him, and he is essentially it's enacting the last portion of the book of Revelations. Those who have lived a good life are being called forth and they're rising to heaven. They're coming up here. And those who have done bad things in their lives are being damned to hell. Here's hell right here. Bad things are happening to them. They're getting pulled down by demons. And it's a visual representation of essentially the tenets of Christianity, the tenets of the faith. Up here at the top, this essentially is the Old Testament. The Sistine Chapel is a retelling of the Old Testament, and this right here is essentially the last few books of the New Testament. Along the walls of the Sistine Chapel, you will see here all of this stuff right here, the paintings above this red line that I'm drawing out. Those are panels painted by Raphael. Those are not done by Michelangelo. But Michelangelo did the bulk of the painting in the Sistine Chapel, and he hated it. He loathed painting. He thought of himself as a sculptor first and foremost. The ceiling of the Sistine Chapel took, I think, I'd have to double check my notes really quickly, like 4 years. He did not lay down on his back to paint the whole thing. Instead, what he did was he had scaffolds built all the way up to the ceiling, and then he stood on them and tilted his head back and painted while the paint dripped into his eyes. All of the painting on the ceiling, all of the painting here in The Last Judgment is fresco work, meaning that he painted it directly onto wet plaster, and he would smooth on the plaster and then have about a 2 by 2 foot square of wet plaster to work off of, and then he'd have to quickly paint it all. Very, very quickly. This is really difficult work, and it took him like 4 years to do each part, the ceiling and then the altarpiece. His work is really controversial here for a number of reasons. You will notice there are lots of nude figures all throughout this image, and that was something that the Catholic Church was not real crazy about. Also, he's got some weird, like, mythical creatures down here. Like, this is Chiron from, like, the Greek mythology. He's the ferryman who takes you across the river Styx into the underworld. Why in the world is he in the Catholic Church? That doesn't make any sense. But Michelangelo is deeply Renaissance. He is drawing from a mixture of sources.